Under the relentless sun, the remote village seemed to simmer in a haze of heat and dust, the air thick with the scent of parched earth. Every surface radiated warmth, from the cracked clay walls of the modest huts to the uneven stones that littered the narrow paths winding between them. The villagers moved with languid motions, their faces slick with sweat, the dry wind carrying the faint sound of distant animal calls and the low hum of chatter. Amid this suffocating atmosphere, Leia stood at the base of a steep hill, her shoulders already beginning to ache from the weight of the first stone placed upon her back. The stone was rough, jagged, and heavier than it seemed possible for a young woman of her stature to carry. Its edges dug into her skin through the coarse fabric of her tunic, but she gritted her teeth and adjusted her stance, refusing to let a single whimper escape her lips. The villagers who had forced her into this cruel task gathered nearby, a ring of smirking faces and pointed fingers. Some leaned lazily on makeshift wooden staffs, while others sat on low stone walls, pretending to rest but never ceasing their malicious observation. Their laughter cracked sharply through the air like dry twigs snapping beneath boots, each cackle meant to mock and belittle her. One particularly coarse man stepped forward, nudging a smaller stone onto her path as she prepared to take her first cautious step. The sound of rock grinding against rock was deafening in its immediacy, a cruel punctuation to the harsh sun and the oppressive silence of the hill itself. Leia swallowed hard, her jaw tight, feeling the first beads of sweat slide down her temple and sting her eyes. Her palms were raw from gripping the rough surface of the stone, her fingers trembling with the effort to maintain balance. Each step she took seemed to stretch her body to its limits, the hill unrelenting in its slope, the sun unyielding in its intensity. Despite the excruciating burden, Leia moved steadily, her legs burning with every step, her back straining beneath the weight. Her lungs drew in the hot, dry air in shallow, deliberate pulls, and every inhale seemed to sap a little more strength from her body. But there was something in the set of her jaw, the unwavering gaze of her dark eyes, that made even the cruelest observer hesitate for a moment. It was as though she carried more than just the stones on her back. She bore a quiet strength that refused to be broken, a resilience that seemed to radiate from her very being. Some villagers whispered to each other, unsure whether to laugh or to step back, their amusement faltering in the face of her unwavering composure. The sun climbed higher, intensifying its burn, turning the dirt paths into a blistering ribbon of heat that seemed to rise and curl around her legs with every step. Dust clung to the sweat on her skin, forming a gritty paste that scratched against her arms and neck. The stones themselves seemed to pulse under the weight, an almost imperceptible vibration that she felt through her shoulders and down her spine. Leia did not speak, did not plead, did not falter. She moved with careful precision, matching her breathing to the slow rhythm of her steps, one foot in front of the other, each placement deliberate and measured. The hill rose before her like a relentless wall, yet she approached it as if guided by some inner compass, a quiet determination pushing her forward despite the mocking voices and the oppressive heat. A group of villagers called out from the sidelines, taunting her, their voices sharp and cruel. "She'll break before she reaches the top," one shouted, throwing a smaller stone at her feet. It bounced harmlessly against the dirt, but the gesture was enough to make her toes skitter, threatening her balance. Another laughed, loud and coarse. "Is that all the strength she has? The stones will crush her yet." Leia ignored them, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Her muscles screamed with exertion, her shoulders burning, but she refused to let their words dictate her pace or her spirit. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a controlled focus that seemed almost unnatural in its steadiness. Even the sun appeared to hesitate over the hilltop, casting long shadows that stretched across her path, highlighting the contours of the stones and the strain etched into her body. As she climbed, a faint wind began to stir, teasing at the edges of her tunic and carrying with it the distant scent of the river that ran along the outskirts of the village. The wind whispered through the sparse trees and dry grasses, brushing against her sweat-slicked skin like a fleeting promise of relief. And yet, there was something strange about the stones themselves. Though they were heavy and unwieldy, there was a subtle hum, a vibration that seemed to respond to her breathing, to the tension in her muscles, almost as if the stones were alive. Leia felt it under her hands, a faint thrumming that pulsed in tune with her heartbeat. She did not understand it fully, but a quiet intuition told her that these stones were more than mere earth and rock. They held a power, a secret, and that the burden they imposed was not merely physical. Her steps continued, methodical and unbroken, as the laughter from below gradually became tinged with uncertainty. The villagers had begun to notice the unnatural steadiness in her stride, the way her dark eyes did not falter, the way her body seemed to absorb the weight without breaking. Unease rippled through the crowd. Some looked at one another, questioning if the task they had forced upon her was truly possible to enforce. Leia, feeling the subtle pulse through her hands, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The stones carried their weight, yes, but they also carried something more, a quiet reckoning that was only beginning to reveal itself. By the time she reached the first plateau of the hill, her body slick with sweat, her legs trembling with exertion, the villagers' laughter had faltered into whispers of confusion and unease. The stones seemed heavier now, yet she felt a strange lightness in her spirit, a knowing that the burden she bore was not hers alone to suffer. There was a growing tension in the air, a sense that the ordinary laws of labor and cruelty were shifting under the sun's harsh glare. Leia's gaze swept over the gathered crowd, her breathing steady, her hands gripping the stones as though they were extensions of herself. And in the silent, simmering moment, a foreshadowing crept into the minds of the onlookers. These stones were no ordinary burden, and the consequences of forcing her to bear them would not remain with her alone. Step by step, Leia continued upward, muscles quivering, sweat streaming, and the jagged stones digging into her skin, yet her eyes shone with unwavering determination. The villagers' whispers grew quieter, the mockery fading into nervous glances. Above her, the sun blazed mercilessly, illuminating the hilltop as if spotlighting the unfolding scene. And beneath the surface of every stone, beneath the sweat, beneath the labor, a silent, growing power waited, ready to respond, ready to shift the balance of cruelty that had been forced upon her. In the sweltering heat, amidst the dust and strain, Leia climbed on, bearing more than just the weight of the stones. She carried the quiet, inevitable reckoning that was about to awaken. The riverbank near Leia's home had always been a place of calm and subtle magic, a narrow ribbon of water winding its way through the parched land, reflecting the sun in liquid gold during the early hours of the day. Leia's small home rested at the edge of this river, a modest structure of clay and straw, decorated with simple carvings of the river's fish and the trees that dotted the banks. The house itself was unassuming, yet it radiated a quiet warmth, much like the young woman who lived within it. Each morning, Leia rose with the sun, her bare feet touching the cool earth as she stepped outside to greet the day. She would tend to the small garden at the back of her home, coaxing life from stubborn soil, watering herbs that the villagers both revered and feared for their medicinal properties. Her fingers, nimble and precise, could prune a stubborn root, weave a healing poultice, or repair a torn garment with equal grace. The villagers knew her routine, yet they never fully understood it. Some admired her diligence, noting how her efforts brought fresh vegetables, sweet herbs, and healing remedies to the village. Mothers would quietly send their sick children to her doorstep, whispering thanks when the herbs worked their quiet magic. Travelers passing through would marvel at her ability to read the flow of the river, to predict the coming rains, and to sense subtle changes in the weather or the mood of the village itself. She had an uncanny skill in sensing strength and weakness, not through any mystical incantation, but through observation, intuition, and the quiet steadiness of her spirit. One could watch her for hours and notice the subtle way she adjusted her posture around the strong or frail, how her eyes lingered on subtle signs of tension, fatigue, or deceit, always absorbing, always calculating, always prepared. Yet for all the respect she earned, there was a simmering undercurrent of fear. The villagers admired her, yes, but they also feared her quiet independence, the way she refused to bow to petty authority, the way she carried herself as though nothing in the village could shake her. Older women would whisper in marketplaces about how Leia spoke with the river, how her eyes could see beyond the ordinary, and how her calm demeanor masked a strength that few dared to challenge. The children, drawn to her kindness, would approach with wide eyes and shy smiles, while the men of influence would avert their gaze, uneasy at the combination of quiet power and unwavering integrity. Some feared that her abilities were unnatural, that her understanding of people, her anticipation of their desires, her ability to remain calm in the face of hardship, hinted at something beyond the mundane. Her days were a balance of labor and attentiveness. She would rise before dawn, gathering fresh water from the river, the cool liquid running over her hands as she filled clay pots and jars. She moved silently along the path between her home and the community center where she offered aid, her presence unassuming yet commanding in subtle ways. When disputes arose in the marketplace, Leia was often called upon, not as an official mediator, but as a trusted observer whose quiet counsel carried weight. She never raised her voice, never sought to dominate a conversation, yet her words, when spoken, held the precision and authority of one accustomed to reading the hearts of those around her. People noticed and they respected her, but they also kept a cautious distance, wary of testing someone whose understanding of strength, both seen and unseen, was so keen. There were moments of solitude that few observed. In the evenings, Leia would sit by the riverbank, the rhythmic lapping of water against the stones matching the calm beat of her heart. She would close her eyes and sense the subtle vibrations of life around her, the rustling leaves, the pulse of animals, the whispers of the wind through the grass. These moments of connection were not known to the villagers. They thought of her as merely quiet, diligent, and capable. Yet in truth, Leia was attuned to the hidden layers of the world, sensing the tensions, strengths, and vulnerabilities in all living things. This awareness gave her a profound understanding of human nature, a clarity in anticipating actions, and an instinctive ability to move through life without unnecessary confrontation, yet never without readiness. Her independence was evident in every choice she made. She prepared her own meals, repaired her home without assistance, and managed her modest store of herbs and crafts. No one could persuade her to act against her principles, and while some villagers respected this quality, others resented it. Her stepmother, for example, viewed Leia's autonomy with a simmering jealousy, frustrated by the quiet admiration Leia inspired among those who would otherwise have deferred to her own authority. Young men would glance at her with tentative curiosity, but her calm demeanor and keen perception discouraged frivolous attention, leaving them both intrigued and intimidated. Despite the admiration and fear she inspired, Leia's life was not solitary in a bleak sense. She was deeply connected to the rhythms of the village, assisting elders with tasks, guiding the children safely along the riverbank, and teaching basic herbal remedies to those eager to learn. She shared her knowledge selectively, revealing insights only to those she trusted, further enhancing the mystique surrounding her abilities. People would watch from afar as she worked, noting how her hands seemed to coax life from barren soil, or how her voice, soft and melodic, could calm a frightened child or soothe a quarrel between neighbors. And so, Leia's reputation grew not through boasts or displays of power, but through the quiet consistency of her actions and the subtle ways she exerted influence over her surroundings. Respect mingled with fear, admiration intertwined with envy, and her independence became a symbol of both inspiration and apprehension. It was a life built on resilience, intuition, and a deep understanding of both human nature and the unseen energies that moved through the world. Leia carried her burdens long before the villagers forced her to bear stones, and it was this inner strength, this unshakable core, that would define her as the events of that fateful day began to unfold. In every glance, every gesture, and every silent action, she exuded a power that was as much spiritual as it was practical. Villagers may have whispered about her independence and feared what they did not understand, yet it was this very strength, the calm wisdom, the unyielding resilience, the ability to see beyond the surface, that set Leia apart. She moved through her days not with arrogance, but with quiet authority, and it was this combination of capability and restraint that would ultimately transform the burden forced upon her into a tool of reckoning far beyond their imagination. The sun had barely reached its zenith when the small cluster of antagonists gathered in the shadow of the village's crumbling granary, a place hidden from prying eyes and wandering children. They huddled close, voices low, the heat of their envy thicker than the sweltering air. Among them was Elder Tano, a man whose age had granted him respect but whose pride had long been wounded by Leia's quiet influence over the younger villagers. He stood with arms crossed, a deep frown etched across his weathered face, muttering to himself as he watched her from a distance the day before, noting how the children and adolescents flocked to her side to learn herbs, listen to her counsel, and seek guidance for minor disputes. "This girl," Tano hissed, "walks as if the village belongs to her. She does not bend, she does not bow. And yet all the youth gather at her feet, listening as if I am nothing." His companions nodded, their own grudges surfacing with every muttered word. Some were farmers frustrated by Leia's quiet success in cultivating crops in stubborn soil. Others were women whose attempts at herbal remedies failed in comparison to hers. Their resentment was a mix of fear, envy, and wounded pride, coalescing into a dangerous determination. They had watched her for years, noting how even when misfortune struck the village, Leia seemed unshaken, her calm presence offering subtle solutions while the rest floundered in panic and uncertainty. The plotting began with whispered observations. "She moves with power," one woman murmured, fanning herself against the rising heat. "Even the men hesitate when she speaks. It is unnatural for one so young." Another chuckled, though uneasily, "Unnatural or not, she thinks she is above all of us. Above the elders, above the children, even above Tano." Their laughter was low, tense, filled with a brittle edge that only hinted at the venom brewing in their hearts. Plans began to take shape, simple yet cruel: humiliate Leia publicly, remind the villagers of their authority, and force her into labor that would wear her down, perhaps even break her spirit. Elder Tano, with a sharp finger, traced the slope of the hill that led to the edge of the village's dry storage pits. "We will give her stones," he said, voice steady with grim conviction. "She will carry them up that hill from dawn until dusk. Let the sun scorch her back and her muscles fail. If the girl is truly strong, she will survive, but all will see she is nothing but flesh and sweat, subject to the laws of mortality like the rest of us." There was a pause as the others considered the plan. Murmurs of agreement passed through the group, punctuated by occasional laughter or the cracking of dry sticks under their feet. The act itself seemed almost ceremonial, a ritual of power reversal meant to remind the village that Leia, for all her quiet influence, was still bound by human frailty. Yet beneath the surface of the plan, subtle cracks of unease began to appear. One of the younger men, barely in his 20s, hesitated. "Are we certain this is wise?" he asked, glancing nervously at the way Leia's gaze had once silently measured the villagers in the market square. "She may be quiet, yes, but her strength, there is something about her that does not belong to ordinary people." Elder Tano's frown deepened and he snapped back. "Fear is the refuge of cowards. Do you wish to cower while she commands respect? No. We act now. She will carry the stones, and we will remind the village of our authority." The plotting continued as the sun climbed higher, each conspirator feeding their resentment into a shared resolve. They whispered of humiliation and spectacle, of laughter that would echo through the village square, of mockery that would mark Leia's shoulders with the weight of stones as surely as the labor would mark her muscles. There were discussions of logistics. Which stones would be used, how heavy they should be, who would watch to ensure she did not escape or receive sympathy from the crowd. Every detail was meticulously planned, each act a demonstration of their desire to diminish her spirit while showcasing their own perceived superiority. And yet, amid the whispers and planning, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of tension. Leia's quiet strength had never been challenged directly, and even as they plotted, the conspirators felt it pressing upon them like the heat of the noonday sun. It was a reminder that she had not only survived the judgments and skepticism of the village but had thrived in spite of it. Her calm, unassuming demeanor, her ability to read others and remain composed, was now the very reason they felt compelled to act, yet also the seed of unease that gnawed at the edges of their confidence. By the time the plan was finalized, the conspirators had convinced themselves that they had control, that the stones would break her, the sun would scorch her, and their authority would be unchallenged. They departed the hidden meeting spot with a mixture of triumph and anticipation, unaware that the very burden they intended to impose upon Leia was quietly awakening a power that would respond not to cruelty but to injustice. The seeds of jealousy had been sown, the plan set in motion, and the first step toward reckoning was now inevitable, waiting silently in the weight of the stones and the sun-scorched path that Leia would soon traverse. The morning sun burned fiercely over the village, turning the dirt paths into a shimmering expanse of heat. The villagers had assembled at the base of the hill, their eyes gleaming with expectation and malice. Leia stood at the starting point, her arms stretched toward the first stone, the rough surface biting into her palms. The air was thick with anticipation, yet it was heavy with the unsaid, an almost tangible sense of underestimation that the villagers carried like a weapon against her. "Pick it up, girl," one of the older men barked, slamming his staff against the ground. The sound echoed, a sharp, violent punctuation to the laughter that rippled through the crowd. Others jeered, offering commentary on her supposed weakness, their voices like stones themselves, meant to press down on her shoulders even before she hoisted the first load. Leia bent quietly, her breath steady, her movements precise. She wrapped her fingers around the jagged edges of the stone and lifted it with the quiet deliberation of someone who has measured her strength against the limits of endurance many times before. The stones were heavier than any reasonable person could carry for long, yet Leia bore them with a calm that frustrated the villagers. Her steps were deliberate, careful, placing each foot on firm ground, balancing the weight against her body with an innate understanding of leverage and persistence. She did not stumble, she did not falter, and her silent focus drew more attention than any shout or jeer could. Children peered from the edges of the crowd, wide-eyed, sensing the quiet defiance in her posture, sensing a power beyond mere muscle. As she climbed the hill, the villagers' cruelty intensified. Shouts of derision rang in the air. "Is that all you've got?" one man called, while another laughed so hard he fell backward onto the scorched earth. They waved sticks and mocked her carefully measured breathing, convinced that the weight of stones would soon break not just her body but her spirit. Each stone she carried seemed to grow heavier in their eyes, yet lighter in hers, as if her resilience fed from the very doubt they cast upon her. The heat was oppressive. Sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes, soaking her clothing. The sun glared mercilessly, yet Leia did not allow her attention to falter. Her muscles ached, yet every movement was purposeful, every step calculated to maintain balance and forward motion. She had faced hardship before, endured the quiet judgment of others and carried burdens unseen, both physical and emotional. These stones, heavy and unyielding though they were, became part of a rhythm, a testament to endurance rather than defeat. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some villagers glanced at one another, unease creeping into their expressions. She keeps going," one muttered under his breath. "Surely no one can endure this." Leia's silence, her refusal to plead or protest, only deepened the tension. Each stone carried was a quiet defiance, each step a reminder that the measure of strength was not in cruelty imposed, but in the ability to bear it with unwavering dignity. By midday her body was slick with sweat, her arms trembling under the relentless burden, yet she moved with precision. The villagers' confidence wavered, subtle cracks appearing in the facade of their cruelty. They had believed this task would humiliate her, demonstrate their dominance and extinguish her quiet authority. Instead they found themselves facing an endurance that defied expectation. Leia's determination was visible not in grand gestures, but in the unbroken rhythm of her labor, a silent statement that strength could exist without anger, that resilience could shine through suffering. The day wore on and the stones continued to ascend, one after another, each heavier than the last. The villagers' laughter began to falter, their shouts less commanding. They were witnessing a truth they had not anticipated. Leia's quiet power was unyielding, her body and spirit aligned in a harmony that their cruelty could not disrupt. The more they tried to assert dominance, the more their own weakness became apparent, their jealousy mirrored in the very endurance they sought to crush. As she paused for a brief moment to adjust her grip and catch her breath, her gaze swept across the villagers, calm and unwavering. No words passed her lips, yet every eye in the crowd felt the weight of her silent presence. They had intended to belittle her, to demonstrate her inferiority, yet in that unspoken glance, they recognized a force beyond their comprehension. Leia's quiet strength, her unwavering resolve, had turned their cruelty into a mirror of their own limitations, foreshadowing a reckoning that the stones themselves would one day deliver. The first stone Leia lifted had seemed ordinary enough, rough, jagged, heavy, but as she hoisted it onto her shoulder, a faint vibration traveled through her hands, subtle yet unmistakable. It was almost imperceptible, a quiver beneath her fingertips that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She paused for just a breath, letting her eyes flicker over the stone, and then continued upward as if nothing had happened, hiding the intrigue behind her calm demeanor. The villagers, oblivious to the subtle anomaly, jeered and mocked her, assuming her cautious movements were signs of fatigue rather than the awareness of something extraordinary. With each successive stone, the vibrations grew, almost like whispers of hidden energy flowing through the mineral mass. Leia's practiced hands felt the changes instantly. Some stones felt lighter in her grasp than their actual weight should allow. Others seemed impossibly dense, as if testing the limits of human endurance. She had seen the way the villagers handled the stones, careless, forceful, and with no respect for the materials, and she could not help but notice that the weight fluctuated depending on who touched it. For her, it was manageable, almost pliable, as if the stones themselves were responding to her strength and resilience. For the others, a mere brush of their hands caused the stone to thrum with resistance, sending sharp jolts of imbalance that made them flinch. The faint humming was another mystery. It began as a near inaudible resonance, like a sigh from the earth itself, yet gradually it became perceptible enough that Leia could hear it as she adjusted her footing on the steep incline. She did not speak, did not alert the villagers, for revealing awareness might provoke them to act with even greater cruelty. But each subtle tone, each low hum, hinted at a secret that the stones carried, a consciousness of sorts or a latent power tied to those who bore them. Leia sensed that the stones were not passive instruments of labor, but living, responsive objects, aware of the injustice of her punishment. Her steps, careful and deliberate, masked the ease with which the stones seemed to align with her body. She allowed her breathing to match the rhythm of the vibrations, a silent synchrony that minimized strain while maximizing control. The villagers, unaware of the hidden qualities, continued their shouting, expecting her to falter under the weight. Their taunts, their laughter, only strengthened the subtle power that pulsed through the stones, as if the burden itself fed on the cruelty that imposed it. Leia's endurance became both a demonstration of human resilience and a conduit for the stone's secret strength. She noticed other peculiarities as well. Small particles of dust rose from certain stones in patterns that seemed unnatural, like trails of silver that caught the sun and sparkled briefly before vanishing. Tiny fissures along their surfaces emitted faint glows when struck against the ground, almost like sparks of latent energy awakened by friction and effort. Leia's eyes, trained to notice subtleties, took in each anomaly, cataloging them silently while continuing her laborious ascent. To the villagers she appeared fatigued, but in truth she was attuned to the whispers of power hidden within each jagged mass she carried. The oldest among the villagers, Elder Tano, noticed Leia's calm, her apparent ease in handling what should have been torturous loads. He muttered to himself, unease creeping into his voice. How can she bear this with such poise? The others laughed it off, assuming he was simply worried about their own position, unaware that even the slightest doubt could awaken the latent energy of the stones further. Leia's silence concealed not weakness but awareness, a subtle manipulation of forces that were not fully understood by any mortal eye. Each stone, Leia realized, seemed to respond to her intent. When she focused on moving steadily, on keeping the rhythm of her steps and breaths, the stones became almost pliable, easing the burden against her shoulders. When she allowed herself to imagine justice, the vibrations intensified, subtle tremors moving through the mass as if reinforcing her resolve. There was a sense of sentience, a quiet cooperation from the stones themselves, that promised more than physical assistance. They carried potential for retribution, a slow, inevitable reckoning that would unfold when the moment was right. As the sun climbed higher and the villagers' voices grew hoarse from shouting, Leia continued upward, each step synchronized with the almost musical pulse of the stones. She feigned fatigue when necessary, lowering her shoulders under the weight with deliberate effort, nodding occasionally as though each grunt and stagger were signs of human weakness. Yet her mind was fully aware. These stones were more than mere punishment. They were instruments of consequence, patient, waiting, and attuned to the balance between cruelty and endurance. By the time she reached the midpoint of the hill, the subtle power of the stones had become undeniable, even if only to her. She could feel the way they subtly guided her steps, how the faint hum resonated in tune with her heartbeat, how the slight tremors strengthened with her determination. Leia carried not just physical weight, but a secret force, one that would soon transform her punishment into a reckoning, and her resilience into a tool that the cruel villagers would never forget. The burden was alive, and its quiet awakening had only just begun. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the sun-scorched hill as Leia adjusted the heavy stone on her shoulder, sweat streaming down her face. Her eyes were calm, steady, focused not on the villagers' cruel jeers but on each careful step that carried the burdens upward. The crowd had grown larger, drawn not just by cruelty but by morbid curiosity, expecting to see her collapse under the weight, humiliated and defeated. Elder Tano shouted from the edge of the path, "Keep moving, girl. Don't let the stones slow you." The others laughed, some nudging each other, confident in the inevitability of her exhaustion. Leia, however, remained quiet, her movements deliberate, almost meditative, her awareness attuned not only to the weight of the stones but to the subtle vibrations that pulsed within them. Each footfall resonated with the hidden energy, each breath synchronized with the faint hum she alone could sense. It was in that tense, sun-drenched moment that an opportunity presented itself. A slight stumble by Jairo, one of the younger men in the group of tormentors. He had been leaning too far, mocking Leia with exaggerated gestures, when his foot caught on a loose rock near the path's edge. The momentum sent him staggering dangerously close to her. Leia's instinctive reaction was to step aside, giving him room, her hands steady on the massive stone she carried. Then it happened. A stone slipped from her burden, rolling, but not in the expected path toward her feet. Instead, it curved almost unnaturally, guided as if by invisible hands, and fell directly on Jairo's foot. The sound was horrific, a loud, crushing snap that silenced the laughter and shouts immediately. He screamed, hopping and clutching his foot, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. The other villagers froze, their mockery evaporating into a stunned, fearful silence. Elder Tano's jaw dropped. "What? How?" he muttered, voice trembling. He stepped forward, his staff shaking in his hand, ready to scold or punish her for some perceived trick. But Leia remained impassive, her eyes dark pools of calm, betraying no hint of triumph or fear. Her silent composure only amplified the unease radiating from the crowd. The stones, it seemed, had responded not to brute strength but to the moral imbalance around them, the injustice of cruelty imposed on a patient, enduring spirit. Whispers rippled through the villagers. "Did the stone move by itself?" one stammered. "It cannot be," another said, though his voice lacked conviction. A tense atmosphere hung in the air, the heat from the sun mingling with the cold realization that the punishment intended for Leia had somehow turned upon one of the oppressors. Jero writhed on the ground, clutching his shattered foot, and looked up at Leia with a mixture of fear and awe. The others meanwhile took a cautious step back, uncertainty clouding their faces. The laughter that had earlier filled the hill was gone, replaced by an almost tangible tension. No one dared to approach, no one dared to speak too loudly, as though any sound might summon further consequences. Leia's gaze swept over them, calm yet piercing. She said nothing, letting the unfolding scene speak on her behalf. It was clear, the stones were no longer passive burdens. They responded to more than weight or movement. They resonated with intention, with moral equilibrium. Acts of cruelty invited retribution. Acts of patience and endurance invoked protection. The villagers, who had believed the stones to be mere instruments of humiliation, now saw them as sentient enforcers of justice, their subtle power awakened by the injustice they had tried to impose. By the time the panic subsided, Jero lay on the ground, whimpering and clutching his foot, while the other tormentors hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Some glanced at one another, guilt creeping into their expressions. The hill, once a stage for public humiliation, had shifted in energy. The very stones themselves had marked the first strike, a warning that cruelty carried consequences far beyond expectation. Leia continued her climb, stone balanced on shoulder, unshaken by the incident. Her quiet strength was now complemented by the hidden force she carried in her burden. The crowd followed in stunned silence, witnessing a first undeniable sign that the stones were alive to injustice, and that they answered to something far greater than human strength or malice. The village had always been a place of harsh sunlight and hotter tempers, but now an unusual chill threaded through the air. Even as the sun blazed overhead, villagers began to feel a subtle unease, a prickling at the nape of the neck that seemed tied to Leia's laborious climb up the hill. Word of Jero's accident had traveled quickly, and whispers spread like wildfire. Mothers hushed their children, elders muttered warnings, and those who had helped plan the cruel task cast anxious glances at the young woman who carried stones heavier than any mortal should bear. "It was the stones," one whispered to another, eyes wide with disbelief. They move against cruelty." The words barely left his lips before he looked down at his hands as if expecting the smooth rock in his own home to react violently. Everywhere people turned, they saw the effects of minor accidents. A tool dropping unexpectedly, a cart tipping over, a loose stone shifting beneath the foot of a man who had mocked Leia earlier. The incidents were subtle, yet cumulatively unnerving. Fear began to root itself in the hearts of those who had plotted her humiliation. Leia, however, remained calm. Her arms moved with steady precision, her body in rhythm with the stone's subtle vibrations. She did not rush, did not groan or protest, maintaining the image of a woman merely enduring a great physical burden. But those who watched closely could feel a shift in energy, a weight beyond the physical pressing down upon the villagers' consciences. Each stone she carried seemed to resonate with her quiet moral strength, amplifying the consequences of the cruelty aimed at her. Children peered from doorways and behind carts, sensing the power that surrounded her, though they could not name it. Some of the plotting villagers began to stumble without warning. Tools slipped, their footing faltered, and whispers of impending doom grew in the air. It was as if the very earth had decided that those who intended harm should now feel vulnerability. The sense of retribution was slow, deliberate, and perfectly aligned with the rhythm of Leia's steps. One of the elder men, who had quietly plodded alongside the others, dropped his heavy hoe without explanation. His face paled, and he swore under his breath, mumbling that the stones were cursed, though the words carried no conviction. Others laughed nervously, attempting to mask their fear, but the tension was unmistakable. Each observer sensed that the rules had changed. Cruelty no longer went unchecked, and endurance paired with purity of intent could awaken forces unseen. Even as these minor incidents unfolded, Leia's focus never wavered. She seemed to float above the chaos, her movements deliberate, her breathing calm. Her silent strength magnified the supernatural aspect of the stones, which appeared more alive with each step. The rocks hummed faintly, resonating with her moral resolve, responding not just to the weight of her body but to the integrity of her spirit. It was clear to anyone paying attention that these were not ordinary stones, and that Leia carried something far greater than physical weight. She carried justice in a form both subtle and inevitable. Fear took root among the villagers, not as a momentary fright but as a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Every glance toward Leia reminded them of the first strike, the crushing of Jairo's foot, and every minor accident that followed. The very ground beneath them seemed to pulse with quiet judgment, as if the earth itself were observing who deserved its favor and who did not. Even those who had not directly plotted her suffering felt the creeping dread, a realization that the balance of power had shifted, and that cruelty carried immediate and personal consequences. By the time Leia reached the mid-hill marker, whispers had turned into cautious conversations. Some dared to ask if perhaps the girl's strength alone had nothing to do with it, that the stones themselves were instruments of justice, reacting to the moral intent of those around them. Others muttered prayers, attempting to shield themselves from further incidents, though no ritual seemed enough. Leia's calm presence was a constant contrast to the rising panic, reinforcing the notion that she was both protected and empowered by forces beyond the comprehension of the fearful villagers. The sun continued its climb, relentless in its heat, yet Leia's aura of quiet strength seemed to bend the energy of the hill itself. Every step, every measured breath, magnified the supernatural quality of the stones, reminding the villagers that their own malice had awakened a consequence beyond human control. Fear, once a fleeting emotion, now took root firmly, embedding itself into hearts and minds, ensuring that none would underestimate the power of endurance paired with justice ever again. The sun blazed mercilessly over the barren hill, its heat radiating off the dry, cracked soil. Sweat streaked Leia's face, soaked her tunic and ran down her back, yet she continued to hoist the stones onto her shoulders, each one heavier than the last. Pain gnawed at her muscles and her lungs burned with every careful breath, but her mind remained clear, focused, unwavering. Each step upward was not just a physical act, it was a meditation, a mental preparation for the reckoning she would unleash, tempered with patience and moral clarity. She recalled every slight, every whispered insult, and every cruel order given by those who had sought to oppress her. Yet she did not dwell in bitterness. Instead, she translated her memories into resolve, building a vision of justice that was precise and untainted by malice. Leia knew that the stones were more than mere burdens. They were alive, sensitive to intention, and would respond to her purpose. She breathed slowly, aligning her mind with the rhythm of her labor, understanding that anger might cloud their power, while focus and clarity would magnify it. With each step, she imagined the balance of fairness tilting back toward those who had been wronged by the village's cruelty. The heat pressed down upon her, relentless, but she welcomed it as part of the trial, a refining fire that burned away doubt and hesitation. Her body moved in tandem with the stones, each step a deliberate reinforcement of her vision. She imagined the stones remembering the injustice, storing the energy of the cruelty they had been subjected to, waiting patiently for the moment it would be released. As Leia climbed, her mind wandered to simpler times. Days spent by the river, the gentle laughter of neighbors who had once respected her quietly, her small home where she had learned to endure hardship with grace. She felt a surge of gratitude for the lessons embedded in those experiences. Patience, observation, and the quiet understanding that power lies not just in physical strength, but in the composure of the mind and the purity of one's intent. Each memory strengthened her connection to the stones, and she sensed their latent energy responding to her mental focus, vibrating more insistently as if acknowledging her readiness. The villagers' mocking shouts echoed behind her, but they no longer provoked fear or irritation. Leia allowed them to fade into background noise, treating each taunt and sneer as fuel for the purpose she carried, not hatred but intention. The stones seemed to hum more audibly, resonating with the steady cadence of her heartbeat. She visualized justice not as a chaotic vengeance but as a natural order being restored, the consequences falling upon those whose actions had caused harm, their fate guided by the energy she now channeled through the stones. She thought of the first strike, Jairo's crushed foot, and allowed herself a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but quickly redirected it into focus. The incident had shown the stone's responsiveness to her moral intent, and she understood now that any misstep in thought or emotion could weaken the outcome. Anger, cruelty, or vengeance would interfere. Clarity, composure, and purpose would intensify the power latent within the burden she bore. Her determination became a guiding force, a quiet authority that the stones seemed to obey with increasing fervor. Her muscles ached with every lift, every careful step up the incline, yet she embraced the physical strain as part of her preparation. Pain became a rhythm, pain became a teacher, and pain became a conduit for focus. She imagined the stones remembering every act of cruelty, every malicious laugh, every threat, and storing that energy patiently within their rough surfaces. Each bead of sweat, each labored breath, and each measured step was a signal that the stone's latent force was now ready to act, awaiting only her final command through her intent and focus. The sun's heat intensified, the path steeper, yet Leia's mental vision sharpened. She pictured the moment when the stones would no longer be passive, when they would release their accumulated energy in alignment with justice. Her mind's eye saw the oppressors staggered, weighed not only by their misdeeds but by the force of the very burden they had imposed on her. She walked without hesitation, her steps deliberate, her breathing controlled, her consciousness entirely devoted to the moral clarity that governed her power. By mid-afternoon, Leia's resolve had reached a peak. The weight of the stones no longer felt like punishment. It was a conduit, a channel for the energy that had long been waiting for a mind and heart aligned with purpose. She understood that the stones would act with precision, guided by her vision and tempered by her calm determination. No malice was needed, intent and clarity were enough. The villagers who continued to watch from below sensed the shift even if they could not name it. The air around her seemed charged, vibrating subtly, as if reality itself acknowledged the coming reckoning. Each step upward reinforced not only her physical strength but also her spiritual and mental preparation. She embraced the scorching sun, the crushing weight, and the jeers behind her as part of a larger process. Leia's determination was absolute, her intent unwavering. The stones, alive with secret power, pulsed in harmony with her purpose, awaiting the moment when the culmination of patience, endurance, and moral clarity would transform the burden into an instrument of inevitable justice.